Some of us have a dim memory of studying English at school, and one of the more grueling aspects, usually sometimes exciting, were the set books that you had to read. Now, in my generation, one of the set books that came up a lot was E.M. Forster's Howard's End. And I don't remember much of it, but the subscript of it, with Howard's End, the subscript was only connect. Only connect. And perhaps that is what this meeting is about. Perhaps it is a good motto for this meeting and for the whole question of faith and culture. So that I hope that well, we are already making connections between ourselves. It's very good. The people here from Aberdeen, from Wick, from Oban, there are Gaelic speakers and non-Gaelic speakers, I'm afraid, and East and West, and then we have a speaker coming to us from Edinburgh later today. So I hope we'll sort of get to know each other, or get to know each other more, and form friendships, and then be able to generate energy to do things. And I think it's good to connect with what is going on culturally in the north of Scotland. It's good to connect with the figures of the past, the culture carriers, as they say, iconic people, lest we forget. Because if we don't connect, then we forget. And when we forget, we fall to bits, we fragment. And so I hope we can elicit, or at least think about eliciting and renewing, the connections between the cultures that there are up here in different forms on the one hand, and faith and the church on the other hand. So the two hands. So I hope the two hands can shake, or even wild dream become the two hands of one person. But only connect, because connections enrich and separations impoverish. And if we think of the history of any country, or even any part of a country, or of any culture, it is always riven by ruptures of one kind or another, uprootings. And Scotland has had its fair share. With, if we think of the Reformation, obviously, if we think of the divide between the Highlands and the Lowlands, if we think of all the story around the enclosures in the 18th century, and then with the Industrial Revolution, the polarization between the urban and the rural, and so on. So there's a lot to sort of overcome, or a lot to heal. So I hope only connect, and also complementing that is surely just asking questions. I mean, that was beginning last night very much. I mean, Andreas launched us in good directions there. So perhaps I can just suggest some of the connections and some of the questions that we might be looking at. Now, one difficulty when we turn to the idea of culture, which I'd like to do, is that sort of culture is everywhere, and nowadays everybody seems to have a culture. Bikers have a culture. Football teams have a culture. Hairdressing is culture, and so on. And I mean, it's true, I suppose. It is true, but then if culture is everywhere, it tends to be nowhere. And the concept, we do want to know roughly what we're talking about. And so when it's so diffuse, it becomes elusive. Well, I thought, because after all, one is a cleric, I thought perhaps it might begin with the Bible, which is, I suppose, rather a key element in our culture. I used to notice when I first moved up here 44 years ago that Scottish newspapers were fuller of allusions to Scripture, often in the headlines and so on, than the papers south of the border. I'm not so sure that's true now. But there'd just be phrases, biblical phrases, used unconsciously, really, or something, loaves and fishes or something. These little words that you'd find. However, now Andreas made this extravagant claim that Gaelic was spoken in the Garden of Eden, but I'd like to begin from the same place. And I'd like to begin, if you want to understand culture, you've got to go to the book of Genesis. If you want to understand anything, you've got to go to the book of Genesis, actually. And there are, in the first 3 chapters, there are, as we all know, 2 creation narratives. There's the one about the 7 days, which we hear at the Easter Vigil. And then there is the second one, beginning in chapter 2, when the Lord God takes the soil of the earth, creates, as it were, a little man in shape, a doll almost, breathes life into its nostrils, and the man became a living being. That is Adam, the man. And that symbolizes, expresses very beautifully, the action of creation. But then there's a further stage. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till it and keep it. To till it and keep it. Now this tilling and keeping is culture. That is culture. First there is the act, the divine act of creation, in which God has the sole initiative. But then the human being is placed in a garden to till it and keep it. And the word culture, which comes from the Latin, cultura, means, first of all, of course, cultivation of the land. Agriculture is the primary culture, etymologically, anyway. I know it's not the first thing human beings did because they were hunter-gatherers and so on, but that is a paradigm in a sense for all forms of culture. So what emerges here is the relationship between creation on the one hand and culture. Or, if you're shy about the word creation, then nature and culture. So agriculture presupposes the earth, the soil, it presupposes the sun, light, heat, rain. It presupposes the different kind of things that we can grow and the seeds and so forth. And that is, as it were, the material on which agriculture works. Now, let me quote from the Constitution on the Church in the Modern World of Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes. And it has a whole chapter in its second bit on the proper development, true development of culture, which is something you might care to look up. You can Google it easily enough. I mean, it's not a thrilling read, but there are some good ideas in there. And it says, it begins like this: man, the human being, humanity, comes to a true and full humanity only through culture. That is, through the cultivation of the goods, the good things and values of nature. Wherever human life is involved, therefore, nature and culture are quite intimately connected, one with the other. There's a first connection between culture and nature culture and creation. That is being ruptured rather radically in some ways nowadays. But culture is the human unfolding, the human deployment, the human development of the potential of creation. So it is actually co-creation. Well, that's what being made in the image and likeness of God means. Tolkien used the phrase sub-creation of he creates this whole imaginative world, and he is a sub-creator. He is creating under and hopefully in tune with the creator. So culture is ultimately a form of cooperation or synergy between God and man. To put it more simply, still in the Catholic perspective, in the biblical perspective, culture per se is a good thing. God wants culture, right? And this is how we become who we are meant to be. Now, particular cultures always need redemption, so on. That's another matter. But culture still itself is a good thing. And the core of creation or nature in the biblical worldview is, of course, ourselves, the human being. The land or the garden to be cultivated is ultimately us. And so again, to quote from Gaudium et Spes, the word culture in its general sense indicates everything whereby man develops and perfects her many bodily and spiritual qualities. So the garden that we are to till and keep is first of all our own humanity, actually. So now just to bring this to the Point and the north of Scotland and so on, and the west. I know more about the north in a way than the west. But to take George Mackay Brown, of whom we'll hear later, the Orcadian poet, he cultivated the land of Orkney, you could say. This was the land he worked on, in the sense that so much of his, all or virtually of his writing is about its landscape, its history, its characters, you know, the postmen and the tinkers and all of that, about its disruptions and communities. So it's always, and often many of the great sort of writers who are remembered, and poets and so on, are identified with a particular place and a particular people and a particular area, Thomas Hardy and Wessex and things like that. And the poets and the Lake District and so on. So it is a question. We live in a very uprooted culture. So what lands are our contemporary cultures cultivating? That's just, I don't know. Don't know if that makes any sense, but there we are. That's just a thought. Now, that's the first thing from Genesis, but here's another. Because the word Genesis means origins, beginnings, and Genesis is all about origins and the first things, what came first. This is what's so gripping about it. And one of its interests is the origins of culture. And so we get these little phrases every so often. Abel was a keeper of sheep. You know, where did the sheep come from? But anyway, Abel was a keeper of sheep. Cain tilled the ground. And then Cain built the first city. Now, does anybody know? He gave it a name. I think if anybody knows the answer to that, the first city, they could have a free holiday in the Bahamas on yes. Well, he called it after his son Enoch. So there we are. But, leaving that behind, then it goes on. Well, another of his descendants was a chap called Adar. And it says, Adar was the father of those who dwell in tents and have cattle. his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and pipes. Zillah bore Tubal-Cain. He was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. This is chapter 4, verses 20 to 22. So here we have diverse expressions of culture emerging: shepherding, music making, metalwork, and identified with people. So here, a first link, you see, is culture to creation stroke nature. Second link is culture, obviously, has to history. Creation, it has a beginning, it has a development. There are people, there are names involved. Now, this here we can go off on a glorious tangent, I think, because, and this is quite a strong thought in the thought of John Paul II, the importance of sort of iconic people to a culture, to any culture. And this is very true if you think about it. And you need to, you look at a banknote and who's on the banknote and so on, who are the sort of people that we put on our banknotes. Now, if you think of Israel and if you think of the Jewish people, I mean, there's a people who have kept a culture, my God, and revived a language. I mean, it's quite something. And that is to do with, Abraham, David, Moses, Abraham, Moses, David, the prophets. There are these people. And this is one of the forces that hold it together. In the church, we have the apostles, we have a history of sanctity. We know the great saints, and then the popes have come to play a very important part here in the last sort of couple of centuries as somehow embodying the church and so on. But this is true of any culture. And I think it's very good to connect with that. Now, this is a digression which isn't a digression, but you see, 2016 was the 900th anniversary of the martyrdom of St. Magnus in Orkney. Now, in that archipelago. Now, it struck me very much that the Orkney Island Council said, we will have a year of St. Magnus. Now, that's a council, secular or whatever. We will build, as a part of this, we will build a pilgrim way, which follows from where he was taken ashore after being killed on the island of Egglesay onto the main island, and then where he was first buried, and then when he, sometime later, when his body was taken to the cathedral in Kirkwall. And so they were doing, all of this was being done, and there are all events, and there's already the Magnus Festival. So for a variety of causes in the 20th century, the figure of Magnus suddenly came alive again in the archipelago, right? And I thought, most opportunities in life I miss, but I thought that here's a fascinating phenomenon, actually. And in this secular world, here is a whole, the 20,000 people who live in Orkney, and they are saying, we want to mark the 900th anniversary of a saint. Now, it probably didn't occur to most of them, but it crossed my mind, of course, this guy's a Catholic, and we ought to be there. We ought to be part of this. We ought to connect with this, basically. And so anyway, we had, in the end, so we contacted, the council and everything. And it was a fascinating experience. So to my utter astonishment, I persuaded all my fellow bishops in Scotland. I didn't think I had such power. And invited the Bishop of Oslo and the Bishop of Copenhagen, because they were Vikings, if you like, to come, and all these people came, and we were allowed to use the beautiful cathedral, which is now, well, it's not strictly speaking in the hands of the Church of Scotland, but in the hands of the people of Orkney, actually. But how can we connect with the culture? Now, the monks came back here in 1948, and of course, this part of the world then would have been more sort of avowedly Church of Scotland and Presbyterian than it is today. And what enabled the monks, and what has long enabled us to be kind of rooted in this area and make connections, was the fact of restoring an ancient building. You know, monks are, by definition, the very antithesis of the Reformation, really. Really, for various theological reasons. And you could expect, at the very least, suspicion. And there has been that. But on the whole, there has been, like Andreas said, you know, when he went to the church and 3 people invited him to dinner afterwards. Shame to say that would never happen in Aberdeen. But unless they were Polish, actually, they'd invite you to. But the fact of this building becoming alive again elicited sympathy. And it brought all sorts of contacts and connections. It's like, as you were saying, Father, about, you know, speaking Gaelic in Skye, you know, it just opens doors. And funnily enough, restoring a building and having to get people to come and do it and getting to know them and all of that, and then people coming out to visit, all that. So there are these things, these elements. So that's, you know, that's something historical that can be used as a bridge. At breakfast this morning, we were talking about this a bit, and I know in Caithness, for example, some of the worthies of your parish are trying to recreate this pilgrimage way from Tain, which is associated with St. Duthoc, to Kirkwall, or at least up to the north of Caithness. Pilgrimage, all sorts of people go on pilgrimage. It's a tremendous draw for people. Recently, the papal bull founding the collegiate church in Tain was restored. This is from the 14th century, I think, and this was restored. They actually had a copy, the original copy. It somehow survived everything. It was restored, and again, it was, you know, an event was made, and the local authorities and the civil authorities, and they invited the parish priest and the dean, and I put my finger in as well, and there it was. You know, there are all these. We want to take these opportunities where there are commonalities, and we can build up. But anyway. But we will be hearing about some of the writers later today. But who are the persons involved, you know, in the cultures here, and how can we connect them? Next thing comes along in the book of Genesis. Won't dwell on it really, but it's the story of the Tower of Babel, and that is a story of cultural distortion and arrogance. And almost ideology, really. We will build this tower, which will reach to heaven. So we don't need God, basically, and we will create our world. We will create this brave new world, this civilization, and of course, the whole thing breaks down, shatters, and is followed by fragmentation and mutual incomprehensibility. It's quite a powerful story, that, of what happens, you know, what happens when an ideology collapses and so on. And yet it's not outside divine providence. But there is the perversion, how a culture can go almost collectively perverse. We have had some stunning examples of that in the 20th century and in our own century as well. But just to jump to Exodus, now the second great book of the Bible, which tells the story of the slavery of the people in Egypt, and then their liberation and their crossing of the Red Sea, and they're making their way to Mount Sinai, and there the covenant being made and the law being given. But what we often forget is that a large part, almost half of the book of Exodus, is about the building of the tabernacle, or the tent of meeting, which itself looks forward to the Temple of Solomon, and which in the biblical narrative, the Temple of Solomon is regarded as the climax, a culmination of creation. It's interesting. So that there are links between the first chapter of Genesis and the descriptions in Kings and Chronicles and so on of the building of the Temple of Solomon. That when the temple is built and the divine presence enters the temple in response to the prayer of Solomon, then creation is completed. Now, immediately you begin to see another connection. There was in some American Catholic thinking in the 1920s and 30s, and there was play on cultivation, culture, and cult. But these things are etymologically, but really connected. But because it's called the tent of meeting in some of our translations, isn't it, in Exodus, and it's the place where God and man meet, and that is the purpose of creation, is precisely that God and man will meet, that God will be present among us. That's realized in the Incarnation above all, and the Eucharist, and we will be present to God. But here's a relevant bit, interesting bit, chapter 31. Then the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with skill, ability, and knowledge in all kinds of crafts, to make artistic designs, for work in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, and to engage in all kinds of craftsmanship." I mean, he's quite a guy, this Bezalel. And it's attributed to the Spirit of God. So it's very important. "Moreover, I have appointed Aholiab, son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, to help him. Also, I have given skill to all the craftsmen to make everything I have commanded you: the tent of meeting, the ark of the testimony with the atonement cover on it, all the other furnishings of the tent, the table and its articles, the pure gold lampstand and all its accessories, the altar of incense, the altar of burnt offering and all its utensils, the basin with its stands, and also the woven garments, both the sacred garments for Aaron the priest and the garments for his sons, and the anointing oil and fragrance incense for the holy place. They are to make them just as I commanded you." So, this is a very rich thing. Here is creativity, here is human creativity permeated by the Holy Spirit, and in view of creating the tent of meeting, the place where God and man meet. And that's ultimately what culture is about, so that our cultural products, shall we say, are called to be sacramental, really. Does that make sense? And it's worth adding, if we're thinking, because the church has a culture, but if the great cultural artifact of the church is the liturgy, and all that goes with it. I mean, it's an incredible thing, the liturgy, just from a cultural point of view. And the blending of words and actions and signs and symbols and all of this, and the where all this stuff comes from, goes back to the Old Testament and so on. It doesn't exhaust Christian culture, but it embodies it in a particularly intense way and leads it to its goal, which is the glorification of God and the sanctification of humanity, the realization of the covenant. I will be their God and they shall be my people. So maybe culture is meant to be a bridge between cultivating the land and worshipping God. The cult. It's not a nice word, cult, somehow, but perhaps one can assess a culture, discern a culture, judge a culture by its connection to these two. It should be connected to the soil, and it should be connected to the soul in some way. It's interesting, if you look up a Latin dictionary of cultura, you've got meaning one is all the stuff about the land, and then meaning two is opened up by a quotation from Cicero. The culture, cultura animi, soul or mind, is philosophy. Is philosophy, the love of wisdom. So that's the second meaning. And then we would say, well, true wisdom is to worship the Lord. So when we're thinking of the own culture, I suppose we all live in many cultures actually at the same time. But you know, how do they fit? But just think of you know what happened at the beginning of Holy Week in Paris. It's fascinating, really. I mean, terrible, but not simply terrible, because that fire brought to light how a cathedral, a place of worship, can be an epicenter of a people's, you know, architectural, literary, musical, social, and political history. It's a very, and it suddenly reminded us of what such a building can be. Should remind Europe of what it is that really holds it together. And I was speaking to a French woman yesterday, and she said what is interesting is a lot of people are just, apart from, you know, there were very moving scenes at the time when the fire was happening, the people standing there and then and people going to pray and everything. She was saying, you know, many people are just going to look at what has happened and just sort of stand there contemplating this, and they're not believers, many of them. I mean, France is a very ruptured country, and they're going there, and yet here's this unity, here's a connection, here's something that holds a people together. So, question is, you know, can our cultural expressions find some place, if not in, at least around the liturgy? You know, at least this, what we're doing culturally could conceivably at least be in the forecourt, or as a gargoyle, or as a flying buttress, or just a signpost to the cathedral, as it were. That would be how it should be anyway. Well, now, you can put it another way. The Bible, it has been said, well, I don't know if it has been actually, but one of my brethren in the monastery said Leviticus, the book of Leviticus, which nobody reads, but which is the first book that a Jewish child has to read in the Bible, right, is all about food. And the Bible is all about food, actually, from beginning to end. And so is culture. And so the garden is cultivated. The animals are husbanded. Why? Not for fun, or not to grow prize-winning dahlias, but because we need to eat, right? And so cooking follows on. I mean, cooking is a great part of culture, huge part of culture. And after agriculture, you've got to have cooking to bring this stuff into our stomachs and help us live. So culture keeps us from starvation. That's what it's really about. Culture is bread. Well, in the wake of the fire in Notre Dame, the Archbishop of Paris, I haven't got the exact quotation, but he said the most important thing in our cathedral is a piece of bread. And the story of its rescue, is the rescue of the Blessed Sacrament, is quite interesting, from this courageous priest who was the chaplain to the fire brigade in Paris. Quite a character, I think. But anyway, certainly a brave man. So, the culture, another connection, therefore, would be surely culture and the Eucharist. And perhaps all culture is about transubstantiation in a funny sort of way. Cooking is a kind of transubstantiation, isn't it? Really, you're changing this into edible matter, and we're all looking for supersubstantial bread. So, what is the connection of our culture with the Eucharist? I think, as we heard, but I mean, in parts of the West, that connection is still there. Just. Is that fair enough to say? But in other parts. But anyway, at least the Mass will be the centre of our meeting. Well, to move towards the conclusion of this incoherent ramble. Now, Pope Francis loves to call the Church a mother. And historically, she has been a mother of culture and of cultures. A key moment in history, though it probably doesn't keep us awake at night, but it was a very key moment, was the iconoclast controversy in the 8th and 9th centuries in the Byzantine East, when there was this huge movement that there should not be images in churches, and massive destruction was done, and there were many martyrs. That's why, in fact, there are very few icons that survive from before the 8th and 9th centuries, because they were all destroyed. I mean, we've experienced iconoclasm in this country. It's a terrible thing. It's very strange. In the, you wonder what Jesus would say about it, but in Old Aberdeen, where I live now, and there's the old town house, which was sort of the centre of Old Aberdeen, which was a separate city until the 19th century. And outside of it, on a pillar, was a statue of Our Lady and the Child. And that in the 17th century, which was worse than the 16th century, the 17th century, that was smashed up and disappeared. But then in the 19th century, somebody found, just sort of dug up in their garden in that area, the base of the pillar. And so they erected a new pillar, and on the top of this pillar is this old base. I don't know, I mean, there's something to be thought about there. It's rather strange. But I like to think in my wilder dreams that it's waiting for this, for Our Lady and the Child to come back. It's just a strange thing. And that's bang in the centre of Old Aberdeen. So there it is. But, the fact that the Church rejected iconoclasm was a massive endorsement of art, crucial, and of human creativity. That would be another topic. And then we can say it was alluded to yesterday, I think, in the discussion, but perhaps the tragedy of the West in recent centuries has been the separation of, as it were, the cultural enterprise and the Church's motherhood, the separation of culture and faith. Well, faults on both sides, really. It's not a simple story. But there have been some wonderful bridge builders. It is, if you think, thinking of poetry, 20th century, 19th, 20th century poetry, you've got, who are some of the leading poets? You've got Hopkins, you've got T.S. Eliot, you've got David Jones, who isn't so well known, but very interesting. Now, they were all artistically modernists, but they were all believers. They were all Christians. Then, in France, you've got somebody like Paul Claudel, who was converted at the age of 18 in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Great 20th century poet and dramatist. You've got somebody like Olivier Messiaen, who was a French composer, organist for 61 years in another Parisian church. And then you've got, in Poland, there's Henryk Górecki, for example, as a composer, and then in Estonia there's Arvo Pärt, and all these people are explicit believers. It's worth reading St. John Paul II's letter to artists in 1999, but that's another topic. But another question for us, is what can the church offer to the protagonists of culture, at least culture in this sense? Or what would they like from the church? And if we have failed them, how can we atone? What can we do to reconnect? What openings of the heart on both sides are needed? It is, I wonder, it is interesting. I heard a program about contemporary literature and how much of it is dystopian now. In other words, that's the opposite of utopian. In utopian literature, you were envisaging a perfect, wonderful place, placeless place, where everything will be fine in a proper society and everything. And apparently a great deal of contemporary literature that looks to the future is dystopian, the very opposite. That is going to just get worse and worse and worse. And we are heading for something dreadful. That's what, the spirit of prophecy in these writers is saying. It's interesting. So what can the church offer? Can it be the famous thing of hope? Of hope. Culture and the rainbow. The rainbow says that God will not destroy us. God will not flood us over again. And along with faith, of course, is memory. I think this is our strong card because, we have a memory in the church. Do this in memory of me. That's the central act. The first thing that's asked of the church is to remember. And we have a long memory as Catholics. I think that's very much a feature of the Catholic mind and the Christian mind, but perhaps the Catholic mind and the Orthodox mind in a very special way, that we can call up resources from the past. Somewhere Chesterton uses the image of the church as owning a great estate or a great farm, and certain fields lie fallow. Some are cultivated and some lie fallow. And then suddenly the Spirit moves us to say, well, why don't we grow something in this field now? And this will provide the food that we need in this time. It's an interesting thought. Speaking more generally, after the French Revolution, the Church took a very, I suppose, negative stance towards modernity. And then sometimes in more recent times, it's swung towards a rather more gullible approach towards modernity, that we should just take it on board, whatever it is, hook, line and sinker. But really what Gaudium et Spes and Vatican II was for critical engagement that was critical. I don't mean necessarily negative critical, but astute. Pope Francis would say discernment. We are meant to discern what is going on in our culture and separate the true from the false and the good from the destructive and so on. And it is the laity who's meant to do that, because you're forced to do it, because if you're working in the health service or wherever, you're confronted with these things. But there it is. Okay, I will conclude. I began with Adam, tilling and keeping. Well, I'd like to end with Adam, because Adam, in a way, embodies culture. He's the first culture vulture, as it were, as the first. He's the first. We don't have I was talking this with Kieran yesterday. We don't have a verb, a noun, I mean, for someone who engages in cultural activity, which is all of us. We don't say culturer, or cultivator has other suggestions. But there it is. But one of the last poems of George Mackay Brown, I think his finest really, is called The Harrowing of Hell, and it is set on Holy Saturday, right? That ambivalent day between death and resurrection, and perhaps a day that could symbolize the state of contemporary culture between despair and hope. Tomorrow, the Son of Man will walk in a garden through drifts of apple blossom. Well, how wonderful it would be to reconnect culture's digging and delving with the wounded Son of Man on his way to resurrection. How wonderful it would be if Adam, the first first person to engage in culture, could turn with a cry to Christ. That would be the ultimate thing. So thank you very much. That's it.